It started with the screams. Not the horror movie kind, but the real world, panic in your pajamas chaos kind. One neighbor stumbled into the street in a robe yelling that her smart oven wouldn't turn off. Another was pounding on his Tesla, shouting at it to unlock. In the distance, a man sobbed over a Zoom call that crashed mid-presentation. My phone lit up with texts like a wildfire. No Wi-Fi, no security cameras, no smart lock. One message just said help in all caps. But I already knew what had happened. I knew because I had seen it with my own eyes that morning. A yellow bulldozer, dust curling around its tracks, sat parked like a trophy next to a pile of wooden splinters and twisted cables. My tool shed was gone. Obliterated. And standing proudly beside it was Karen, the HOA president, clutching a clipboard like it was a weapon of divine justice. She had no idea what she had just done. She didn't know she had bulldozed the beating heart of the entire neighborhood's internet. And I was about to let her find out the hard way. The day had started like any other suburban Saturday. Birds chirping too loud. Sprinklers making everything smell like wet hose rubber. I was at the hardware store picking up a new router battery backup, blissfully unaware that back home a woman in leopard print leggings and power-hungry delusion was directing demolition like she was invading Normandy. My neighbor Gerald called me in a whisper panic. He said Karen was doing something weird to your shed. I assumed she was measuring it for a fine or maybe taping a passive-aggressive note to the door. Never in my wildest imagination did I think she'd bring in an actual demolition crew. By the time I raced home, it was too late. My shed looked like it had been eaten by a dinosaur. My stomach sank when I saw exposed cables, bundles of them like the guts of a digital octopus. Torn fiber lines dangled like snapped vines. The once secure housing of the entire community's internet access lay in ruins, courtesy of Karen and her bulldozer brigade. Karen greeted me with a smug smile as if she'd done me a favor. She waved her clipboard and chirped about non-compliant auxiliary structures. I asked if she'd even checked what the shed was for. She laughed. Actually laughed. Looks like junk storage to me, she said, stepping over a shattered fiber relay box like it was a broken lawn gnome. I didn't respond. I didn't scream. I didn't even blink. I just stared at the wreckage and started calculating. Because I wasn't just some guy with a shed. I was the person who'd quietly spent 2 years building a private high-speed mesh network for the entire neighborhood. Our HOA's rules had banned visible satellite dishes and most external tech infrastructure. So instead of fighting them, I went underground. Literally. That shed was the central command node. Hidden in plain sight. Fully legal under federal communications law. And Karen had just crushed it with a bulldozer she probably rented with HOA funds. The collapse of the network didn't happen all at once. It started with subtle glitches. Garage doors that wouldn't open, thermostats freezing up. Then came the cascade failure. Security cameras shut off. Alexa devices blurted out error messages. Smart TVs blinked off midstream. The worst was the Ring doorbells. Every one of them went dark within minutes, including Karen's. Watching her realize she couldn't access her front door footage anymore was a moment of pure poetry. She actually screamed into the void like a character in a bad opera. I watched it all from my porch, sipping coffee and nodding silently as neighbors poured into the street demanding answers. Some looked at me like I had answers. I did. But I wasn't ready to share them. Not yet. Later that afternoon, a group of residents gathered in front of my driveway like a mob from a Frankenstein movie. Only instead of torches, they carried smartphones and broken smartwatches. "Did you get knocked offline too?" one man asked. "My kid's online class crashed," another said. "He was taking a math test and now it won't load." I just pointed to the crater where my shed used to be. That's when Gerald chimed in like a Shakespearean narrator. Karen bulldozed it. Said it violated HOA codes. Didn't even ask permission. The murmurs turned into angry whispers. People turned on their heels and stormed off, to Karen's place. That poor woman had no idea the firestorm she'd just ignited. Meanwhile, I was quietly reviewing the footage from my driveway cam, one of the only devices still working, thanks to its independent backup. The feed showed the bulldozer pulling up, Karen directing the crew like a general, and the moment the digger's scoop pierced the side of the shed. The moment my equipment died. But more importantly, it showed Karen ignoring the warning signs. Literal signs. I had placed small plaques, federally required, identifying the structure as a telecom relay. She either didn't read them or didn't care. Either way, I had her on camera. And in the world of digital infrastructure, that meant legal ammunition. Still, I waited. Because sometimes the best revenge isn't instant. It's slow, methodical, and absolutely undeniable. By evening, the whole block was in uproar. Emergency calls were failing to connect. Grocery deliveries couldn't find addresses. Even the HOA's own internal system had crashed, because Karen had ironically insisted it be migrated to my network for better security. As the sun dipped behind the rooftops, the neighborhood looked like a tech apocalypse zone. No Wi-Fi. No smart home controls. No mercy. Karen emerged from her house with a megaphone, trying to calm the crowd. She blamed a system malfunction, then pointed at me, accusing me of sabotage. I just raised an eyebrow. That's when Gerald stepped in again like a true sidekick. Don't be ridiculous. You bulldozed his shed this morning. That was the internet hub. You cut us all off. Karen turned pale. The kind of pale that only hits when you realize you may have accidentally committed a federal offense on live camera. I walked back inside as voices rose behind me, loud and angry and full of disbelief. I knew what was coming next. Karen would double down. She always did. She'd try to blame me, twist the rules, weaponize the HOA charter like it was a sacred text. But this time, she didn't just mess with a lawn gnome or someone's mailbox paint. She messed with infrastructure. She messed with livelihoods. And she had no idea that she hadn't just destroyed a shed, she had bulldozed her own reputation and set off a chain of events that was about to end her reign. I sat at my desk, opened a folder labeled contingency, and clicked open a map of the neighborhood. Every device, every connection, every IP log. I had it all. Not because I was spying, but because that's how the system worked. Central routing, anonymized diagnostics, connection data. I started drafting a report. Not for the HOA. For the city. For the FCC. For the State Infrastructure Board that had co-funded my test project with a tech grant Karen didn't know existed. She thought she destroyed a toolshed. But what she really did was poke a sleeping bear with a bulldozer. And I wasn't just awake now. I was smiling. By the next morning, the neighborhood was a pressure cooker with the lid rattling. People were outside holding tablets that wouldn't load, baby monitors flashing red with connection errors, and smart refrigerators beeping uncontrollably like they were staging a revolt. I overheard one guy shouting into his phone about his crypto rigs overheating because the cooling systems lost network sync. He looked like he hadn't slept all night. I stood at the edge of my driveway pretending to water the grass while absorbing the growing chaos like a sponge. Karen, meanwhile, was walking around in her trademark pink visor and tennis shoes, clipboard in hand like she was the general of a collapsing army. She kept telling everyone the issue was a regional outage, and that she was in communication with the provider, which was hilarious, considering she had crushed the only connection point with a rented bulldozer. I could have corrected her, but I had no intention of cutting her free from the rope she was happily wrapping around her own neck. What people didn't know was that Karen's crusade against me and my shed wasn't random. It was the result of years of petty power plays that had finally escalated to this level. Karen had slowly climbed the HOA hierarchy one fine at a time. First, she targeted the color of mailboxes, demanding they all be repainted dove gray instead of charcoal. Then it was garden gnomes, banned for being a visual distraction. She fined a retired couple for leaving their Christmas lights up until January 3rd. Her favorite move was sneaking around with a tape measure and slapping violations for grass being half an inch too tall. She ruled the HOA like it was her personal kingdom, and my shed had become her latest enemy because it dared to exist outside her understanding. What Karen didn't know was that I'd once worked on private networking infrastructure for government contract. After retiring early, I used my knowledge to build a hybrid mesh and fiber network through the neighborhood, hidden from view to avoid HOA interference. The shed wasn't just a tech hub. It was the heart of a system designed to quietly serve everyone without them even realizing it. Smart homes synced to it. Cameras routed through it. Thermostats, baby cams, electric fences, everything. It ran quietly, efficiently, and better than the outdated commercial provider the HOA insisted on using, which was half the reason people had so many smart devices in the first place. I had saved them from lag and outages for years. Karen bulldozed all of that with a single stupid decision, and now she was watching the ecosystem implode without the faintest clue why. By midday, someone had plastered signs all over the clubhouse gate with giant red letters that read "Bring back the internet." People were starting to connect the dots. I had kept a low profile when I first installed the system, but now that it was gone, folks remembered. They remembered the shed. They remembered how, after I moved in, their smart TVs stopped buffering and their garage apps stopped freezing. I didn't have to say a word. They were figuring it out on their own. Karen, on the other hand, was doubling down. She stood in front of the clubhouse like a malfunctioning mall cop, telling anyone who'd listen that the structure she destroyed was an illegal tech storage unit, and that I was the reason they had no service. The level of projection was almost autistic. That afternoon, a city inspector named Luis knocked on my door. I had been expecting someone like him ever since Karen called the city, trying to report me for unlicensed construction. Luis was polite, wore dusty boots and a reflective vest, and looked more interested in his coffee than in Karen's accusations. I walked him around the property, showed him the spot where the shed had been, and provided blueprints for the original build. Luis studied them and nodded slowly. Then I handed him a folder with FCC documentation, approval for a private node, grant records, project licenses. When he flipped to the last page, his eyebrows shot up. "You got federal permits for this?" I nodded. "And she tore it down?" Another nod. He exhaled a long, slow breath. That lady may have just bought herself a very big problem. Karen wasn't going to like what was coming next, but I didn't feel even a drop of sympathy. Especially not after what she did at the emergency HOA meeting that evening. With the entire neighborhood gathered in folding chairs around the clubhouse patio, she strutted up front with a printed slideshow and started blaming me for everything, accusing me of building an illegal spy shed, threatening that I'd be reported for violating neighborhood trust, even suggesting I had installed military-grade surveillance on innocent families. The gaslighting was so over the top that even her closest supporters shifted uncomfortably in their seat. Gerald, sitting in the front row with a bowl of popcorn like it was a comedy show, whispered just loud enough, "Somebody give her an Oscar." When Karen finished her presentation with a dramatic photo of my shed mid-demolition, like it was a heroic act of suburban justice, I stood up. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't wave my arms. I just calmly walked up, plugged in a USB drive to the projector, and said, "I have a few slides too." What followed was 10 minutes of visual carnage for Karen. High-resolution shots of her standing beside the bulldozer. Time-stamped logs showing active fiber relay use. FCC permit. A graph showing the network traffic routed through the node. A breakdown of all the devices that had used it, including every member of the HOA board. I finished with the demolition video, slowed down, showing Karen ignoring the clearly posted Federal Telecom sign on the shed wall right before it was flattened. The room fell into silence so complete you could hear a squirrel sneeze outside. Karen's face twisted in confusion, then panic, then fury. She tried to interrupt, but I calmly said, "Luis from the city already saw all this. He'll be filing his report by Monday." A hand shot up in the crowd. It was Sandy from down the street. Wait, if that shed was providing all our internet, then why would she destroy it? Gerald chimed in, because it wasn't HOA approved, and she hates not being in control. Laughter broke out. It wasn't a happy laugh. It was sharp, angry. A different neighbor muttered, "She cost me a week of work." Another said, "My kid missed his online exam." The energy was turning against her. Not in a fun, dramatic way, but in a slow, heavy, dangerous way. Karen's eyes darted around like a cornered raccoon. Then, right on cue, a courier stepped into the meeting space. He called out Karen's name and handed her a thick envelope. She opened it, read the top page, and her face went white as printer paper. It was a cease and desist order. Not from me, from the State Digital Infrastructure Office. The language was clear. Tampering with registered communications nodes, even unknowingly, was a violation of federal policy and subject to civil and criminal penalties. Her hands shook. For once, Karen said nothing. She just sat down slowly in the folding chair, papers limp in her lap, mouth opening and closing like a stunned fish. I closed my laptop and walked back to my seat. Gerald leaned over with a smirk. "You gonna fix it?" I looked around the room at the shocked faces, the few nods of appreciation, the slow realization that maybe I wasn't the bad guy after all. "Not yet," I said. "She's not done unraveling. But soon." 2 days after the HOA meeting exploded like a dumpster fire, Karen was already trying to rewrite the narrative. She went door to door with freshly printed flyers, each titled Emergency Response Update, followed by a lengthy screed blaming the unauthorized data shed for the neighborhood blackout. She painted herself as a misunderstood hero who took bold action to protect the community from unregulated technology. I found one of those flyers folded in half and stuffed into my mailbox with the words, "Unsafe structure," scrawled in red pen on the bottom. Apparently, the demolition of a perfectly safe, government-sanctioned hub wasn't enough. Karen was now doubling down, insisting I was a threat. Her efforts might have even worked if the entire neighborhood wasn't still suffering the effects of her bulldozer diplomacy. The dominoes hadn't stopped falling. With the relay offline, the backup systems were overloading, and one by one, devices continued to glitch. A family on the next block had their electric gate lock them in for half a day. One woman's pet feeder system malfunctioned and dumped an entire week's worth of kibble in under 10 minutes. But the breaking point came when someone's medical alert system went haywire. An elderly woman pressed her emergency bracelet and got nothing but static. Her daughter, who lived across town, only found out because she called during lunch and heard the panic in her voice. That incident caused a real stir. Suddenly, this wasn't about buffering Netflix, it was about safety. And the more Karen tried to spin it, the worse she looked. I, on the other hand, was working in silence. After the city inspector confirmed my permits and confirmed Karen's demolition had violated 3 state-level statutes, I'd been advised by my legal contact to keep records but not escalate. At least, not yet. So I compiled my documents, collected witness statements, and began backing up all my footage across multiple drives. My favorite piece of evidence was still the demolition video, slowed down just enough to show Karen pointing and laughing as the roof came down. The sheer glee on her face at the exact moment thousands of homes lost access to their digital lifelines was unforgettable. I even used it as a screensaver on one of my backup laptops. Some art just speaks for itself. Meanwhile, I started rebuilding. Not the shed, at least not above ground. I'd learned my lesson. This time, I upgraded. I quietly installed a new, high-efficiency relay node beneath my garage. Shielded, encrypted, buried in concrete and steel. I worked at night, ran silent ventilation, camouflaged entry points, and made sure not a single exposed cable was visible. I installed a decoy generator shed just to throw Karen off if she ever got nosy again. But the most satisfying feature of all was the software filter I coded into the system. It blocked one very specific address range. Karen's. Her entire digital footprint, from her smart fridge to her Ring cameras, was automatically denied access. It was petty. It was perfect. Of course, Karen didn't take long to notice. Her devices began misbehaving, while her neighbors slowly saw improvement. Little by little, my network was being rerouted through other discrete nodes I'd quietly activated in partnership with other residents. The internet speeds were better than before, and people were quietly spreading the word. My doorbell rang one evening, and it was one of the newer residents, a young couple who ran an online business. They handed me a box of cookies and asked if I could hook them up to whatever magic Wi-Fi the neighbor down the street was using. I told them to give me a day and installed a new node behind their detached garage. Karen's grasp over the neighborhood was slipping by the hour, and she didn't even know why. She did suspect something, though. That became clear when she showed up outside my property with a man wearing cargo shorts, mirrored sunglasses, and a utility belt full of what looked like scanner tools from a sci-fi movie. She introduced him as her private infrastructure consultant, but I recognized the guy instantly. His name was Dave. He ran a booth at the local flea market selling refurbished routers and broken CB radios. Karen sent Dave circling my house like a bounty hunter, scanning the air with some second-hand gadget that beeped every time it passed over a Wi-Fi signal. He got excited at one point and shouted, "Hotspot detected," right before realizing he was picking up the pizza delivery guy's phone. I sat on the porch sipping iced tea while Karen grilled poor Dave about covert relays and black market frequencies. He kept sweating and muttering about 2.4 GHz overlap. Finally, after nearly falling into my flower bed while checking under the porch, he gave up. Karen accused me, loudly, of installing illegal infrastructure again. I smiled and asked if she had a warrant. She left in a fury, swearing I'd be hearing from her legal team, which I assumed meant a very sternly worded email written in caps lock. The real fireworks show came when Karen tried to file a formal complaint against me with the city. What she didn't realize was that her demolition had triggered an investigation, and I'd been in close contact with the city's Office of Telecommunications. When she marched into their office ranting about illegal Wi-Fi, she walked straight into a scheduled audit meeting. The city official she confronted was the same guy I had met weeks ago, Luis. He pulled up the report, laid it out in front of her, and calmly explained that not only was my project legally permitted, but her destruction of the shed had violated both HOA boundaries and public utility protections. She left the office with her mouth clamped so tight her jaw might have cracked. That night, I received an anonymous tip that Karen was circulating a petition to have me removed from the neighborhood. I nearly spit out my drink laughing. Not only did I live on a separately zoned lot, meaning the HOA had no legal authority over me, but my land actually predated the formation of the community itself. I had inherited it from my grandfather, who built the original property decades before the HOA had formed and annexed the surrounding street. In HOA terms, I was like a sovereign nation, a Wi-Fi-powered Switzerland with sarcasm and backup. When Karen showed up to my door the next morning holding her petition, I didn't even open the screen. I just slipped a laminated copy of my deed and zoning exemption through the mail slot. She stared at it like I'd just handed her an alien language and stormed off muttering about calling the governor. Her petition failed spectacularly. Most of the neighbors she approached had already joined my network or were in the process of doing so. Some even pretended to agree with her just to get her off their porch, then texted me immediately to say they were ready to switch over. A few even started openly mocking her. Gerald put up a hand-painted sign in his yard that said "I support local internet." Another neighbor made t-shirts that said "Karen cut the cord." The tide had turned. Karen, once the queen of citations and fines, had become the punchline of her own dictatorship. But I wasn't done. Not yet. There was still the matter of the HOA board, the institution Karen used like her personal sledgehammer. I needed to make sure that even if she lost power, she couldn't just slither back into another role. So I started laying the groundwork for a major shakeup. I called for a community vote to audit all recent HOA expenditures, particularly the ones used to hire the demolition crew. I also sent out a quiet email to neighbors inviting them to a technology safety and infrastructure transparency forum. The subject line was subtle. It simply said, "Let's talk truth." Within hours, I had over 70 RSVPs. Karen may have brought a bulldozer, but I had something much more dangerous. I had time, I had truth, and I had the bandwidth. The week following Karen's failed petition was like watching a slow-motion avalanche. Not the dramatic kind you see in disaster movies with people screaming and snow flying everywhere. No, this one was quiet, inevitable, and entirely of her own making. While Karen kept trying to assert control, the neighborhood shifted beneath her feet. You could feel it. People who used to cower when she came marching with her clipboard now rolled their eyes or turned around mid-sentence. Her HOA board allies were distancing themselves like rats abandoning a smoke-filled basement. Every time she stepped outside, it was like she was walking through fog, unsure of where she stood anymore. And that was because I had started pulling the real wires. Not the fiber optic kind, but the social ones that tied the entire neighborhood together. My first move was the underground rebuild. With the above-ground shed demolished and the legal drama slowly climbing up Karen's back like a cold hand, I turned to something better. Using parts one salvaged from the ruined node and a few specialty items ordered through work contacts, I installed a full-scale, tamper-proof server hub beneath my own garage. It was silent, shielded, and secured behind a biometric entry lock hidden in a tool cabinet. Unlike the old shed, this one didn't just serve the neighborhood, it managed it. I started installing new access points on private properties, all with consent. Gerald gave me full access to the side of his house. Sandy let me run a cable along her back fence. People were eager. They wanted out of Karen's system. They wanted something reliable. They wanted something that worked. Of course, Karen noticed the shift. She might have been out of touch with reality, but she wasn't completely blind. The first sign that things were slipping came when her own Wi-Fi stopped working again. But this time, it wasn't from any demolition. This was me, deliberately blocking her MAC address and any network device tied to her property. She reset her modem 5 times in a row. She called her cousin Dave back out, who roamed her yard again with a strange device that kept beeping at random. I watched from my garage camera feed as Dave tripped over her rose bushes and screamed something about signal vampires. Karen didn't understand tech, but she understood being excluded, and that was a wound to her pride she couldn't bandage with HOA rules. She tried to file another complaint. This time, she claimed I was siphoning internet through private channels, an accusation that would have made more sense if the entire neighborhood hadn't already ditched the HOA-provided network in favor of mine. The real comedy came when her complaint triggered a second inspection, and the city tech who showed up was someone I used to work with. His name was Omar, and we'd collaborated years ago on a disaster recovery mesh project. When he showed up and realized I was involved, he just grinned and said, "So you're the one making suburbia function again." Karen hovered nearby, trying to listen in while pretending to weed her flower bed. Omar, bless him, looked right at her and said, "This guy's doing more for your community's digital infrastructure than the local telecom provider. You should be thanking him." That's when she dropped her trowel and walked inside without a word. By that point, the forum I had organized was nearing its date. What began as a modest idea, a tech safety meeting disguised as a community forum, had evolved into a full-blown neighborhood referendum. We rented out the clubhouse, the same one Karen once used as her personal stage. Only this time, she wasn't invited to speak. In fact, she wasn't on the agenda at all. Instead, we had 3 speakers lined up. Gerald was first, sharing his experience losing access to medical alerts during the blackout. Then Sandy, who talked about her home security system going offline for days after Karen's demolition. Finally, I spoke, calmly laying out what the shed had actually been, what it had done, and how its destruction had affected everyone. I didn't blame. I didn't rant. I simply showed diagrams, footage, and the legal documentation that proved Karen had violated both property law and federal infrastructure code. The room was packed. People stood along the walls. Some recorded the whole thing on their phones. And when I finished, there was a long moment of silence before someone clapped. Then more. Eventually, it turned into full applause. Karen was nowhere to be seen. She'd retreated weeks ago to her fortress of denial, only occasionally emerging to make snide remarks at her mailbox or glare from her porch. But that night, she would have heard the clapping. She would have felt it like a gust of wind slamming a door in her face. The final twist came 2 days later, when I got a call from a local news station. Apparently, someone had tipped them off about a neighborhood hero who rebuilt a secret internet system after HOA sabotage. At first, I was hesitant to speak, but when they promised to keep addresses anonymous and focus on the community impact, I agreed. The segment aired the following weekend. It was clean, respectful, and devastating for Karen. The footage of the bulldozed shed played over my voice describing how neighbors depended on that system for safety, education, and communication. One clip showed Sandy tearing up talking about her security system failure. Another showed Gerald proudly pointing to the new node we installed behind his garage. The story went mildly viral. Not internet-breaking, but enough that the HOA received several emails from people outside our neighborhood asking if Karen had been removed. The HOA board couldn't ignore it anymore. They held an emergency vote to audit Karen's leadership, citing negligence, misuse of authority, and destruction of vital infrastructure. I didn't attend the meeting, but I heard what happened from 3 different people. Karen tried to defend herself, ranting about regulations and visual uniformity, but she was shouted down. Her closest ally on the board, Marlene, turned on her mid-meeting and read aloud the cease and desist letter again for everyone to hear. The final vote wasn't even close. Karen was stripped of her presidency, removed from the board, and barred from holding any HOA position for the next 5 years. Her nameplate was taken down the same night. The next morning, Karen stood in her driveway holding a trash bag full of manila folders, staring at the clubhouse. For once, she looked uncertain. Her visor was gone. Her hair was a little messy. It was the first time I'd seen her without her clipboard in months. She looked across the street at me and opened her mouth like she might say something. But instead, she turned, dumped the folders into her bin, and walked back inside. Maybe she'd finally realized the power trip was over. Maybe she hadn't. I didn't really care either way. I had a network to run, a community to serve, and 1,000 devices to keep humming. She had her silence. That weekend, we hosted a neighborhood barbecue in Gerald's backyard. People brought drinks, lawn chairs, and stories. Kids ran around playing tag. Someone brought a Bluetooth speaker connected to the new mesh node and blasted music without a single buffer. People toasted to better days. At one point, someone jokingly handed me a golden toy router mounted on a stick, calling it the Internet Sword. I laughed harder than I had in weeks. It wasn't just about Wi-Fi anymore. It was about resilience. It was about reclaiming sanity from the grip of one woman's petty dictatorship. The shed might have been destroyed, but in its place, we'd built something stronger. Something invisible. Something unstoppable. And as the sun dipped behind the rooftops, bathing the block in soft orange light, I realized something funny. Karen thought she ran the neighborhood because she controlled the rules. But the truth was, I'd wired this place together long before she ever got her hands on a clipboard. And now every signal, every connection, every gigabyte that flowed through the air, it didn't answer to her anymore. It answered to us. The calm that settled over the neighborhood after Karen's fall from her HOA throne was something surreal. For the first time in years, people weren't living in fear of surprise fines, unsolicited warnings, or random threats over mailbox paint shade. The air felt lighter, the sidewalks friendlier, and the quiet buzz of a stable, high-speed network in every home served as a constant reminder that order had returned without control. But Karen, true to form, wasn't done. While she had lost her official power, her ego was still kicking like a mule in a swimming pool. She couldn't accept that she had become a punchline, a cautionary tale, the central figure in a neighborhood rebellion she never saw coming. So, she tried one last act of desperation. She called the news. Apparently, she contacted every local outlet with a bizarre story about being digitally targeted and electronically bullied by a rogue neighbor who had created an underground network to spy on her. She described me as a cyber vigilante, claimed the shed was some kind of illegal hacking bunker, and even tried to use the cease and desist letter as evidence that she was the victim. One news anchor took the bait and scheduled an interview, but when they showed up to her house, the camera crew took one look at her tinfoil-level rants and decided to change the angle. The resulting segment was not what Karen had hoped for. It aired under the headline Local HOA Chaos: How One Man Saved a Subdivision's Internet. They used B-roll from our barbecue, a short interview clip of Gerald holding a plate of ribs, and a voiceover summarizing how Karen had unknowingly bulldozed a relay hub and caused a week-long digital blackout. She wasn't featured. Not even her name. The video ended up online, and within a few days, it reached one of the larger Reddit communities. r/entitled people. The thread exploded. Screenshots of Karen's old HOA emails leaked, including one where she fined a neighbor for a flag being too flappy in the wind. Memes started circulating. Someone made a digital wanted poster that read, "Have you seen this Wi-Fi wrecker?" Another person created a mock HOA warning letter from Karen that said, "Warning, breathing too loudly during HOA-approved silence hours." The comments section roasted her harder than any courtroom ever could. And through it all, I stayed silent, sipping tea and watching from a safe digital distance while Karen was eaten alive by the very internet she once tried to destroy. But beyond the laughs and online fame, there were real-world consequences she couldn't dodge anymore. The city sent a formal notice regarding the infrastructure damage, citing multiple violations. They gave her a choice: pay the fines, which were now climbing into 5 digits, or face legal action from both the city and the private fiber provider whose equipment had been damaged. She tried to argue, of course, but the footage didn't lie. The documents didn't lie. Her own smug quotes caught on livestream didn't lie. She'd called the shed an eyesore and said she couldn't wait to watch it fall. That quote made it into the official city report, right above the part where they recommended restitution. As the legal noose tightened, Karen did the one thing no one expected. She sold her house. It happened quietly at first, just a "for sale by owner" sign shoved into her yard next to a patch of withered petunias. But word spread fast. The neighbors were practically lining up on the sidewalk like it was parade day. People speculated about where she'd go next, whether she'd try to become the tyrant of a new HOA or finally give up her war on lawn ornaments and gnomes. Some even joked about sending warning letters to whichever community got her next. I stayed out of it publicly, but privately, I kept the original demolition footage stored on a secure drive labeled break glass in case of Karen. The day she left, the whole street felt different. Her moving truck arrived early in the morning, and she loaded it with military efficiency: boxes labeled files, framed rules, meeting minute. As if her HOA career might still be revived somewhere else. She didn't speak to anyone. Didn't make eye contact. Not even when Gerald yelled out, "Need help measuring your next neighbor's mailbox?" She flinched but kept walking. The car door slammed. The engine revved. And just like that, she was gone. The SUV pulled away from the curb and turned the corner, leaving behind only a half-dead flower bed and the faint echo of micromanagement. A week later, the new homeowners moved in. A young couple with twin toddlers and a giant, goofy golden retriever named Butters. I welcomed them with a smile, handed them the password to the private network, and showed them where they could plug in an outdoor camera node if they wanted. They were thrilled. They said the place was a dream, and the fact that they didn't have to deal with the old HOA president made it even better. I didn't say much about Karen. I figured they'd hear the stories soon enough. The HOA, now under a new board led by an elderly former librarian named Judy, who ran everything with calm logic and fresh-baked muffins, restructured all the community rules. They eliminated the most ridiculous clauses, allowed external tech installs, and even partnered with me to expand the underground network across the entire subdivision. We made it official. The old network provider was phased out. My system became the default. Secure, fast, and community-supported. Karen's era was reduced to a single PDF in the archive folder labeled Previous Administration, Lessons Learned. But the best moment came when I received an envelope from the state's Infrastructure Oversight Committee. Inside was a letter thanking me for preventing the potential collapse of a regional smart grid trial, along with a small plaque that read in recognition of unseen service. It wasn't flashy. It wouldn't mean anything to anyone else. But to me it was closure. Proof that the thing Karen had tried to crush with a bulldozer was real, important, and lasting. Proof that doing things right, even when no one sees, still matters. And every now and then, when I log into the system to run diagnostics, I keep a tiny Easter egg in the code. A single line buried deep in the network logs. It simply reads Shed Guardian active. Just a quiet nod to where it all began. A reminder that something seemingly small, an old shed, a few wires, a neighborhood too afraid to speak, can turn into something powerful when the right pressure hits it. It's funny how things work. Karen tried to erase a structure she didn't understand, thinking it would make her stronger. But in doing so, she revealed just how fragile her own power really was. She mistook control for leadership and silence for obedience. And in the end, the very thing she bulldozed ended up becoming the reason she was dethroned, replaced, and ultimately erased from the story she thought she was writing. So now when the neighborhood lights glow at night, and the smart thermostats hum quietly in the background, and the baby monitors flicker safely to life in the nursery across the street, I smile. Not because I won, but because we did. The community woke up. The system was rebuilt. And Karen, well, last I heard, she tried joining a new HOA in a town 2 counties over. She lasted 3 days before someone posted a photo of her measuring a neighbor's lawn with a ruler. That thread went viral too. And I didn't even have to post it. Sometimes, karma just has great Wi-Fi.